Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. The people who work in the medical field, what are some of the scariest last words you've heard from patients? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. A few stay with me. Paramedic for context. I think I'm going to die. It's happened on more than one occasion where a patient directly tells me they're going to die and seconds later go into cardiac arrest. It's so common that a sense of impending doom is a legitimate symptom. Don't let me die. He was arrested as we arrived at the hospital. They didn't get pulses back. Stable on scene, but declined rapidly during transport. That family had no way to know that was the last time they'd see him alive. Me. I'll see you again. Her smiling. No, you won't. Hospice patient I had transported many times before, first name basis. We always said we would see each other again after I dropped her off. That time she replied with the simple, no you won't. It was the last time I ever saw her. Some people just know. That's what is so sacred about the medical field, really. We have this image of giving our last words to friends or family. However, for many of us, our last words will be delivered to the cars of a complete stranger. In those last moments, I'll be whatever you need me to be. Your child, your spouse, your friend. Whatever you say will be heard and carried with me to the end. I've done hospice work, home health care, and worked in a nursing home. The best one was in a nursing home with an elderly man. We knew it was coming soon, but he has no family, so we were taking turns just being with him. He opened his eyes and smiled and said, "It's such a lovely day. Don't let this spoil it." It really was a perfect spring day. He passed about 5 minutes later. The saddest was a lady in hospice care. She kept saying, "Not until they're all here. Not until they're all here." The family finally admitted she had a son that she had disowned many years prior. They tried to locate him but weren't successful. She died crying for her boy. Did you turn off the lights? Me. No, the lights are still on. That's not funny. It's really not Oh. I spent over 30 days in and out of hospital in 2018 for a medical issue I had. Most of the time I had to share a room. In one room I was with this guy in his late 50s there for some kind of serious pneumonia with complications. He was morbidly obese and had diabetes and some other health issues. We were sitting there watching Jeopardy when he said the above. As soon as he said, "oh," he kind of started having trouble breathing, gasping, and a bunch of alarms went off. And then out of nowhere, half a dozen doctors and nurses and such were in the room. Somebody wheeled my bed out to another room. I found out later he'd died of a massive heart attack. I don't know why he thought everything went black first. The doctor didn't know either, though she had some ideas. The head nurse, this tiny Filipina lady, said he was dying. You don't die all at once. Some parts die first. I think about that a lot. I don't know if she's right or not, or if she meant it to be deeper than that. Probably not, but you don't die all at once sticks with me now. Not in the medical field and not from the patient, but when my son was a baby he got pneumonia and was in intensive care. This happened around Thanksgiving time. Shortly before he got sick, there was a school bus crash in my city, so we were there with kids from the bus crash, and there are two things that will always stick with me. The first being the sound of a mom of a little boy made when he died while we were there. It was almost a scream, but not truly, but it was the most heartbreaking sound I'd ever heard. The other was the grandma of the little boy in a coma in the bed next to us. Every day she sat there, begging him to wake up. She'd sit there and tell him if he just woke up, he could have his Christmas presents early. She'd tell him about how everyone was doing, how his parents and siblings were handling everything, how much they all loved him, and wouldn't he please just wake up? Please, baby, wake up, and you can have your Christmas presents. We even got you extra presents. He did survive. I don't know in what capacity, but sitting there, he did live. We left intensive care before he woke up, but the news reported on all of the kids that died, and the last one was the one that we were there for. The other thing was how remarkably kind these families were. They kept giving us food, lol. They had a lot of donated to them since it was considered a statewide tragedy. Might have even made national news. And the families shared it with us. We were the only family not in the bus accident. They would not take no for an answer, and they were all genuinely concerned for my son. They'd ask about him, how he was doing, what his prognosis was, ask about my husband and me, and make sure we were all holding up okay, all while going through such a tragedy themselves. My dad's last word was an answer to a question, hospice. He suffered a spinal stroke that paralyzed him from the neck down, and he could not breathe on his own, so he was on a ventilator for 2 months. We were told he wasn't recovering like he should be, and the term of care at the place he was at was coming to an end. We either needed to transfer him to a long-term care facility or go with hospice care. I wasn't comfortable making the decision without his input, so we got him alert enough and got a device attached to his trach tube to let him speak a little. I explained the situation and asked what he wanted to do. That one word is all he even tried to say. He was just done with it all. I'm thankful to the nurse who helped us and got him through it all, but it's kind of scary how easily a shitty situation can just destroy someone's will to live. This isn't really scary in the way you're asking, but when I was an intern 20 plus years ago now, I was discharging a patient I had a connection with from the hospital to hospice with terminal cancer. This dude had nobody in his life. I told him I'd come visit him, and his last words to me were, "No, you won't." But I actually did, maybe 3 weeks later. I went to the hospice house, and he had already passed away. I was wrecked, but it made me realize how fast things can change, and the impact of my last words to this dying man scared me and stuck with me. My grandfather knew he was dying, and I sat with him for hours as different family members dropped by to say goodbye. He never spoke or really acknowledged them. When everyone had finally left and my folks stepped out for a breather, he started squeezing my hand. I asked if he was hurting, but he didn't say anything. So I asked if he was scared, and he turned his head to look me right in the eyes. I told him it was okay, and I'd be right here with him. He squeezed my hand again and whispered, "Ernie." That was my late grandmother, Ernestine's nickname. So I started talking about her, and that I knew he missed her. So maybe he was more nervous than afraid. I told him he looked really handsome, especially since the hospice nurse had come in and given him a clean shave, just the way Mama liked. He squeezed my hand harder. His eyes got really wide, and he started mumbling, No, that's where I realized he was so anxious. My grandmother's first husband was JP, and they were married for 15 years before he passed away in a logging accident. They loved each other very much and had 5 children. My grandfather married her a little while later, treated her children like his own, and they had 2 children together, with my dad being their youngest. They were married for over 50 years. Yet, when my grandfather's time came, he was afraid that he wouldn't see my grandmother because she'd be with her first husband. There wasn't anything I could say that seemed to bring him any comfort. He just whispered JP over and over, shaking his head while looking around as if he were in the room. All I could say was, JP's got to spend the last 8 years with her. I'm sure she'll be more than ready to see you by now. Collectively, this was a really tough read today, so I apologize for the voice cracking throughout. This stuff's sad. I mean, there's no other way around it. So, whatever you believe in, whatever you hope for, and what you love, I hope that there's peace for all of you. I work as a paramedic. I had a single motorcycle crash into an electric box by a stoplight. He smashed it and ended up in the wood line in a forest preserve. He was injured, but not that badly. We ran it as a traumatic accident and transported it to a nearby trauma center. He was awake and talking en route. As we pulled into the hospital, he grabbed my hand and said, "I see the light. I'm dying right now." I tried to reassure him, but by the time he got into the ER, he had died. The ER doc screamed at us for not having him intubated and so on. I told the doctor what happened, and he immediately apologized. I worked in a seniors' care home for many years and tended to both my parents as they were dying. Most of the elderly would mumble stuff that I couldn't make out, but one woman in particular said something like, "How are you here?" while looking at the corner of the room, a couple of hours before death. Another one told a care aide that her husband was waiting. The care aide told me this just as I entered the room, so I didn't hear that one firsthand. My dad didn't say anything, but the smile on his face was the biggest I had seen in years prior to his death. He named the infant baby stillborn that he and Mom had, a brother that I didn't get a chance to grow up with. My mom said thank you to me right before she died. My sister and I took her to all appointments and kept her in her home while on her deathbed. She was so scared we'd put her in hospice, but we wanted to respect her wishes. Hard, but worth it, in my opinion. I'm on my phone, so formatting and spelling likely suck. I was in the room when my mother's mother came for her. My mom was a hospice nurse. Until I saw this, I didn't know my mom was going to die. But my mom had told me she'd witnessed this scene herself many times. She said sometimes people aren't ready and they fight, but then a day later they talk to the person again and say, "Okay," and pass shortly after. My mother begged her mother to let her live. She cried like a little girl, begging, "Mom, no." I threw myself on her and held her and begged her not to leave me. When the doctor came the next day to say they needed to get her in surgery to remove her necrotic colon, I told him no. She was going to die no matter what. The other thing my mom said throughout her life as a nurse, I want all necessary means to save my life unless they're going to remove my colon. So I had two very clear signs as to what was the correct thing to do. Professionally, I am a respiratory therapist. For context, during COVID, a young guy the same age as me just got married and went on its honeymoon, came back and tested positive. We had him on high-flow nasal cannula, then BiPAP, and then we had to finally make the call and intubate him. He grabbed my hand and looked at me and said, "Oh God, please don't let me die." As a general rule, I never say, "You're not going to die," but he looked me in the eye and was so afraid that I said, "I'm not going to let you die today." I spent 3 weeks with him, threw all the tricks at him, Velletri, proving, ultimately ECMO, and he ultimately died. That one effed me up for a while. Personally, the November before COVID, my grandma was diagnosed with cancer and was going downhill fast. I visited her, and we talked about my wedding, and she looked at me and said, "When is it?" I said, "November next year." She said very plainly, "Well, I won't be there, but save me a seat, and I'll watch from heaven." Then a few days later, I get a call from my mom to say goodbye to Grandma. She had been nonverbal for hours at that point, and she said, "Mija, remember to save me a seat. I love you, and I love husband's name. He will be good to you. Okay, goodbye." Not from the dying patient, but from the mom of the patient who was screaming and crying, "No, you have to save my baby. Don't tell me my baby is gone." That one has stuck in my head forever. I think Mom and Dad had gone out for date night and left the baby with Grandpa. After feeding the baby, no one checked on the baby for a couple of hours, and when the Grandpa went back to check, the baby had spit up some milk, but he was turned over and had aspirated it and choked and already had blue lips when discovered. I remember everyone in the room tried CPR. Random doctors, nurses, EMTs, pharmacists, and cops were all in the hallway crying about this. Went home after my shift and immediately hugged my kid, who was 9 months old at the time. It's the scariest part about having a kid under the age of 1. You need to constantly monitor them after feeding because they can spit up. It's not that scary, but I once had a lady call me into her room at like 2 a.m. and she goes, "So what happens if I die in my sleep? What do you guys do about that?" And this lady at the time was showing no signs of decline or that dying was something approaching her with any speed, but she'd been asking questions about death more and more frequently. She was old, so we thought it was probably just on her mind, and she was wanting to make some preparations for the future or whatever. So I tell her, "Look, unless you plan on dying tonight, I think we can probably have this conversation in the morning." And then she died that night in her sleep. The scariest are the nonsensical ones from their minds being so gone from dementia. The idea that some nonsense shouted is your last dying words is painful AF. I have had a patient who was just the worst woman I've ever cared for. Just a bitter person, manipulative, and fed on hate and anger, somehow since she didn't eat hardly anything. Within 2 hours of caring for her, I was ready to be done for the night. She wanted us to call her emergency contact, her son, so we did. He was the one on his deathbed, and he said, "Look, I'm with my family and loved ones. I want to die in peace, and it will be soon. And I don't want to hear from anyone about that woman again." I went ahead and got him deleted from her medical record as a contact for him. I could not even imagine the pain this dude experienced growing up with that monster for a mother. His words were not scary necessarily, but the whole situation was, and it really stuck with me to this day. During COVID, we had iPads to bring into patients' rooms to FaceTime with family. No visitors were allowed in at our facility at this time. My patient was taking a turn for the worse and needed to be intubated. He wanted to call his family and see them before we sedated him, but we were unable to get anyone to answer night shift. We were unable to wait any longer, and the patient was quickly declining. This was during the initial 6 months of COVID, when everyone in our unit who was intubated due to COVID did not survive. Right before we pushed sedation, he looked at us all and said, "What kind of monsters don't let someone say goodbye to their family?" I had this man the next 3 nights, and he didn't survive. Might not be the scariest phrase imaginable, but I still see this man in my dreams begging to get someone on the phone and blaming me for letting him die alone. Not scary necessarily, but just kind of eerie. Had a lady who was post-surgical from a spine surgery. Geriatric, but definitely on the healthier side, especially compared to the patients we usually get. Not on oxygen, good strength in her extremities, not even in that much pain either. Really nice lady. The student I'm precepting, and I go in and talk to her in the morning. Introduce ourselves, explain the plan of care, and funny nurse one-liners. She's completely oriented and doing well, sitting up in bed eating her breakfast. We explain that the plan is to get her to a rehab center tomorrow so she can get help regaining her mobility before she goes home. Suddenly, she looks a little sullen. "What's wrong? I thought you wanted to go to rehab." "I do. Something just feels off." "Off? Can you describe a little more? Are you in pain? Nauseous?" "No, I just don't think I can do rehab anymore." This was really odd. Per the night shift nurse, she has been excited to get out of the hospital and has been talking about it for a number of days now. She's just not feeling it now. "You don't know if you can walk?" "The rehab nurses are great. They will help you every step of the way." "No, I can. I just don't feel good about it anymore." I kind of shrug it off as anxiety and try to reassure her as much as possible. Then take her vitals. Stable and perfect. PT comes into the room. I tell her I'll let PT work with her, and we'll be back in a few to do an assessment and give her morning medications. That was the last conversation with her. 5 minutes later, they call the code blue. I run in the room, and her face is completely blue. She's struggling to breathe. We pull her onto the bed, and she's lost her pulse. immediately start CPR. Worked on her for 40 minutes straight. Intubated, all her ribs broken. She didn't make it through. I just still think about how she seemed to know, how she was so weirdly aware. I give hindsight as 2020, but I think about it a lot. I remember talking to an old neurologist in the ICU. I just remember her telling me how stupid she felt. She'd gotten scratched by her cat and went into sepsis. She kept talking about how she knew better, but she did too little too late to get it checked out. That one really sucked. Had a guy code on me twice during a diagnostic test on consecutive days. He didn't say anything. He just kinda looked around blankly while his daughters, adults, screamed and panicked. Don't ask why his daughters were there. I raised hell, forced a lot of safety meetings, and changed a lot of protocols after that. Mainly the worst was COVID, just listening to those events alarming non-stop and watching them deteriorate on the telly until it was time to code was the worst. It was like watching trains wreck at the same stretch of track non-stop for like a year. My grandma passed away in December at 95. Born in the Great Depression in rural Nebraska, she had a great life and lived on her own until the moment she went to the hospital 5 days before she left. She ended up with a ruptured gallbladder that was causing severe pain and an infection that would eventually take her. The last time I saw her before she was on palliative care, she told me that this is her choice, that she loves us and is ready to go see Alfred, her husband, and Al, my dad. They put her in an inpatient 24-hour hospice facility just 5 minutes from my house. So I got to spend a lot of time with her and family. Went to see her a bunch over the next week, even though she couldn't communicate. The last time I got to see her was about an hour before she passed. Her breathing had calmed and her body seemed at peace. She was a great woman and cared about all of our well-being. I'm going to miss her a ton. Wasn't in medical at the time, and not necessarily words, but a promise I asked of my dad. It was 2021, and I was a 19-year-old female who was given medical power of attorney over my dad, who was suffering from COVID. He was in an induced coma and on a vent around my birthday. I had a birthday planned away from home with my then boyfriend, now fiancé, and I visited him prior to flying out. I said, "Daddy, promise me you will behave for all the nurses here and wait until I get home to cause any trouble, okay?" Most memorable birthday I've ever had. The night I got home, I visited him and talked for hours about my trip and decorated his room with the photos I took so that he could see them when waking up. I thanked him for being so well behaved and said I would come back in the morning. 5 hours later, he codes and isn't able to keep a heart rate by himself. I had to give the order to stop life support. At his funeral, I said to the effect of, "Dad kept his promises." He hung on to hear one last conversation, knowing I was safe and happy. I'm still traumatized. I now work in a hospital, and sometimes my trauma gets the best of me when I'm walking through ICU and see patients on a vent. I've worked really hard, though, to get where I am, and there's still more healing to do. Not a healthcare worker, but during college I worked in the department of the hospital that focuses on patient experience. It was my job to do rounds, asking patients how their hospital stay has been and flagging concerns. One day, I rounded on the lady who was super calm and cheerful, lying down, watching something. She told me the hospital stay was great. Everything was great. That she had a 100% blockage in her heart, so she was literally just waiting to die. But it was cool because her husband and dog had already passed, and she was ready to go be with them. She shared some memories of them with me, and said a few stories about loving, caring, and living with them, and the difficulties it came with. But also that was worth it. I wish you all could have seen the look on her face. She said, I've been truly blessed in this life. Before we had to end our convo, what she didn't know was that I was super depressed and suicidal. Her words gave me hope, and in that state of mind, having hope can actually be quite scary. Plus the vibe of someone on their way out, talking to someone just getting started. Maybe they gave me strength. Anyway, I thought I'd share. Early on during COVID, we had this really young 20-something-year-old male come down pretty hard with COVID symptoms. We had him maxed out on high-flow nasal cannula for a few days, but he kept slowly deteriorating. He was a truck driver from some state on the East Coast, and all of his family or friends were back home. I remember very clearly that when he got to the point of needing intubation, we gave him an iPad to FaceTime his wife and kids before we turned him. He told them, I love you all very much, and I'll call you after I wake up. He never got to give them that call. He coded after we gave him the RSI meds. Fortunately, we got ROSC after a few rounds, and we kept telling ourselves he's young. He'll be able to bounce back from this. But she never regained any neurological status after that first code. He coded several more times over the next few days. I remember doing compressions on him after his 7th code. His chest felt like jelly. I still think back to the setting up the iPad in his room for his family to see him while we withdrew care. What a terrible way to say goodbye to your loved ones. My own name. I had a confused DNR-DNI patient who didn't have the capacity to make her own medical decisions. During the height of the first COVID wave in the emergency department, this woman was awake and knew she was in the hospital, knew she couldn't breathe, but wasn't with it enough to reverse her own advanced directive. I had 15 patients all dying, and unfortunately, a prayer of living through a COVID infection at that point. She was already blue-lipped and maxed out on a high-flow nasal cannula and non-rebreather mask. I went to her room to hang a med, and she grabbed my arm and begged, please help me. I hung the meds and stroked her hair for a second when we got an overhead that a 20-something-year-old cardiac arrest was coming in, who was probably and obviously the priority. So I apologized, stalked her hair one last time, and gave her hand a squeeze. As I turned to leave and walk out of the room, she just keeps gasping, shouting my name over and over again as my back is to her. Suddenly, the yelling stopped once I was over 20 paces out of the door. I looked back at the room, and she was slouched over back in with Astelo on the monitor, dead as a doornail. I ran back in and put my stethoscope over her heart to listen, flagged down a doctor to officially pronounce her, and went to go to work on the 20-year-old arrest. We didn't even have time to bag her body until 3 hours later. I'll never forget that one. A lot of this only really clicked when I was older. When I was 11, my mom was on her deathbed. After a battle she thought she'd won with lung cancer spread to her brain. My mom was raised Catholic, but we as a family are staunch atheists. Undoubtedly, going through the cruel process that she did, she contemplated her existence, perhaps to drive the point home even further. One of the songs she picked out for her funeral was R.E.M's Losing My Religion. So the dreaded day comes. I get woken up and driven to the hospital. My mom was in so much pain, and it was clear that this was about to be the end. Bits of family had turned and gone in to say goodbye. And finally, it was my turn. As an 11-year-old, I'm absolutely broken and unsure what to even say. She's heavily sedated at this point, but in the final lucid moment with her, she tells me, "Don't say goodbye." I then get taken out of the room as the doctors proceed with the final care. This was 25 years ago. I vividly remember that moment, and as I got older, I reflect on it more and more. On some level, it haunts me. Not really a scary one, more of a mind bender. I was working on a progressive care unit at the time, and I had a patient that had come in for stage 4 liver cancer from alcoholism. It was Easter weekend, and his family said, "We just don't know. He is going to make it until Sunday." This was Friday night. Around 1 a.m. Saturday morning, I, another CNA, and 2 RNs were at the nurse's station eating dinner when this horrendous smell came wafting down the hall. Imagine burnt hair mixed with old coffee and microwaved fish. Still turns my stomach to think about it. We checked everyone out and noticed this smell was right by the patient's room. But what was weird was the smell was only outside the door, not in the room. He was struggling to breathe, and we could all see he wasn't going to make it through the night. The RN discounted the smell and said it was probably plumbing, gave the patient some pain meds, and started to look up family numbers to get them back to the hospital since it was obvious he was dying. Not even 30 minutes later, the house supervisor came out from her office that was located by the car and our locker room and asked what the hell that smell was, that it was all the way down by her. None of us could smell it, so it was really odd. Got up, checked all the patients again, walked by this man's room, no smell, but very shallow breaths happening. Made it to the end of the hall, turned around to go back to the nurse's station, and was assaulted by that god-awful smell. Only this time it was stronger, and seemed to be spreading like a circle around his doorway. You had to hold your breath, then you could, otherwise you would gag. When I poked my head in his room, coming back up the hall, he had passed away. Notified the nurse and got ready to prepare him for his family. What made this weird was, when the family got there, they couldn't smell anything. But once they said their goodbyes and left, we made sure he was prepped and ready. And the smell was not him physically, but more in the air around him. And then the worst of it, the smell followed us when we took him to the morgue and seemed to make it whether we left him in the morgue, though no smell. Over my 25-plus year career in healthcare, that was one of the weirdest ones. Not me, but my sister is an MP. A dying man waiting for his daughter just couldn't hold on. He grabbed my sister's hand and told her, "Tell my daughters they were the light of my life, and I hope we meet in every life, because they made me the man I always wanted to be, and the father they deserved." He passed as soon as his youngest daughter came out of the elevator. My sister was devastated for her and her sister, because if he could have just held on for a few more seconds. The youngest daughter let out a sob that was so visceral, my sister just hugged her on the ground for a few minutes. My grandfather felt his time coming. He would pray to any light source. He called my mom. He'd taken to calling his children just to hear their voices, and his grandchildren's voices a day before he passed, to apologize for his cruelty when she and her siblings were younger. He apologized because he didn't know better. He himself was just a boy when he was married and had to be a man, and he was lost. The day after he passed, he held my aunt's hand and said, I've lived, but now I'm going. He passed quickly after. Former paramedic here. Two patients stick out. The first patient was experiencing respiratory distress. As we pulled into the ambulance bay at the ER, she put her arms straight up into the air and looked up. She said the lights and music were so beautiful, and they're here to take me. She seemed comforted by this, and she didn't sound panicked any longer. She kept her arms straight up in the air and talking about the angels until we moved her to the ER bed. Then she went absolutely silent and stared down toward the floor. The nurse kept asking her permission to cut off her clothes. I explained to them what I just witnessed, but no one took it seriously as I did. She coded 10 minutes later. The second was a man having a massive MI that caused a third-degree heart block that I was pacing. He only asked me 2 questions during our 40-minute transport time. Please hold my hand, and am I going to die? As time progressed, the question of his dying became more like a statement. I was pretty busy during transport, but I held his hand every time I had a spare minute. By the time we made it to the ER, he was painfully responsive, but still had a firm hold in his hand. They took him to the cath lab, where he ultimately died. The second patient effed me up. It's a special kind of hell to be in the life-saving business and have used every tool at your disposal and still lose the patient. Of course, I understood it logically, that sometimes it is just that person's time to go. But learning it from an experience hit a whole different way. My mother was put on hospice care, and everyone in my family started flying and driving in from places to visit her and say their goodbyes. She was joking and smiling with them all. When we were alone, she was asleep. I told her she had a lot to fight for still. I don't remember anything she said during that time. I was so panicked and beside myself for the entire experience. This was back in 2014. She's sitting beside me right now, and we're relaxing. In the last 10 years, we've traveled and visited all those family members in their own homes, gone to movies together, eaten dinner together almost every night. 2 years ago, we bought a house together, and we gardened every weekend. The doctors called it a medical miracle. I call myself the luckiest person alive. Her health isn't perfect, but she functions independently, goes to work, travels, has a pet chihuahua that she takes care of, and she encourages me to be a better person every day. We're making a sustainable food forest on our property, and she's teaching me how to grow things from seeds. I never wanted children badly until this year. I want them to meet her and know her for how awesome she is.